All right, so we are now recording. This week on Tech Talks, we wanted to talk about some data points and some simple analytic tools that you have access to in Canvas. And specifically, we wanted to talk about using those tools to inform your early intervention efforts in your Canvas courses with your students. This is the time of the quarter where if you have a student who is disengaged, who hasn't logged in, who hasn't been turning things in or doing the work, if we can intervene with them early enough and get them back on track, there's still time to do that. But the longer we wait, the greater the likelihood that we lose that student. And even worse, the student may miss withdraw deadlines or refund deadlines if that is what they need to do, and then that ends up harming them financially if we don't get a hold of them in time. So we wanted to take this time of the quarter to talk about some early intervention stuff. So Nick, did you want to, since you have that up, do you want to share your screen? We can just kind of tag team this a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it. We'll keep it flexible. So right now, what I am sharing is our Welcome to Foundations of Canvas course. This is a course that has been designed for instructors, so it's kind of aging out, but we thought that it would be a great example and probably the closest thing that us IDs have to a course that would be, I guess, similar to your experience in the classroom or the online classroom.
People have been interacting with this course like a normal student would, more or less. So we can look at data points without actually showing any student work. So
exactly. So we're going to be talking about specifically access reports today. And this is, like Caleb said, an analytics tool that we have. It's very simple data, but we can do a lot with it and we can infer a lot using it. And so maybe that might be a good time just to bring up a topic or a concept that comes from Ben Whitmore, who's here in the audience, the idea of do no harm. We have access to this data. Students don't always know exactly what Canvas is pulling from them when they log in and that kind of information that's getting shared with us as instructors. But we always want to just be considerate of that fact, and that anytime we're looking at one small piece of the holistic student, we might be bringing in biases, we might not be seeing the full picture. So we always just want to be, I call it the soft touch. We want to have a soft touch when we're working with these really complex systems. So we'll use that frame as we kind of dive in. So if I'm not seeing any comments, so let's just dive right in then. Where we're going to focus on is this People's tab in our course navigation. This is where we'll get access to those access reports. So if you've been in here looking at your student roster, and like we said, this is all just instructors who have access to this faculty development course, so there's not any really sensitive information in here. But if you've been in the People's tab in Canvas, notice on the left-hand side, those are the names of your students. You get their login information, whatever section they are, if it's multiple sections that have been merged or something similar, their role in the class. So you'll see yourself in here as well, and you'll see your own access report, which is always interesting to look at. But what we're really going to focus on is this last activity and this total activity column. So last activity is pretty self-explanatory. It's the last time that they logged in or accessed the course. And then total activity is time interacting, which is a little bit tricky.
yeah.
So what were you gonna say, Caleb?
Oh, I was just gonna say, so that last activity column is fairly helpful because that one is pretty reliable. The last activity, we can be fairly confident that that is an accurate representation of the last time the student logged into this course in Canvas from their account. So like that's the first intervention data point, right? Is we're in week 2 now. If we get into a Canvas course and a student has no entry in the last activity column, that means they have not accessed this course at all. So by week 2, that is a problem, and that's where we want to start intervening and contacting those students and saying, hey, we haven't seen you in class yet. Is there anything I can do to help? Any questions I can answer? Anything we can do to get up to speed? I see Ben's got his hand up.
Yeah, I raised my hand just to kind of address a point that Ben just asked in the chat. Does the time total activity reflect, or last activity reflect, app users and mobile users? Prior to the pandemic, I want to say late 2019, Canvas fixed that. So they're prior to the pandemic, prior to about 2019, mobile users, Canvas app users, that data wasn't being collected and reflected here. So now it is. So you can pretty well, I mean, you guys will probably speak to like some of the reasons why that we don't hold this, as fact, right?
Yeah.
But I think we can rely on this a whole lot more. So it does collect that information now.
Yeah. So then the second column there, the total activity, we had some questions in there. Is that just for this section or for all sections in Canvas? And my understanding is the total activity column is tracking, what it is tracking specifically is amount of time the student's account had this course open in a web browser. So that does have limitations to it, because if I log into Canvas and open up my course, and then I go and play on YouTube for 2 hours, if my Canvas course is still open in the browser, Canvas is still recording that as activity, as time in Canvas. So just because there is a high number there, hours and hours, does not necessarily mean the student has been actively engaged in the course for that many hours. It just means that Canvas has been open for that many hours. And then there are some data limitations there of, I think somebody else mentioned this in the chat. If you get into Canvas and you use Canvas to access an external tool like a publisher website or something, if you have left Canvas in order to do that, it will not track that activity time. So that will not be counted towards your total activity. Yeah, like Ben said, if the apps work within Canvas, then yes, I'm trying to think of a good example of what an app that you might have that is integrated directly into Canvas.
Well, Panopto would be a good example.
Panopto is a great example, yeah. That's not taking you outside of Canvas generally. It's still housed within Canvas, so it will count that. But if it's a publisher website like Pearson or McGraw-Hill or something where you're leaving and going to their website, then it will not track that activity. So total activity is not an extremely reliable metric. So you should be careful about how you use that information, knowing that it has all these limitations and these caveats. But it's there and it's visible, so it's worth mentioning that we have access to that.
I'm just going to double check that we've got everything in the chat. So yeah, total activity is just for this section. Programs integrated. Okay, looks like we're good.
So then should we look at, was there anything else we need to cover on this part, or should we look at the access report?
Well, I'd like to quickly kind of put some attention to this instance specifically. So for this student in this faculty development course, we see that last activity means that they were logged into Canvas, but for example, they have not actually done anything within this course, which would be clicking into a page and scrolling like I am, or doing something like that. So that's an example of an instance where you would want to begin some sort of intervention. Obviously, with a course like this, you'll see that there's some pretty wild total activity. So maybe what we can do, let's use Caleb as an example. You'll be our student for today.
Sounds good.
Looking at their last activity, total activity, makes sense. It's constantly in this course. For a student like this, you could assume, oh, maybe because they have a high total activity, they were in it today, we can expect good student outcomes. We can expect them to be successful. But that's not always the full picture, right? Like we said, total activity could just be sitting on a tab. They're not actually engaging with the course.
I guarantee you I have not actually spent 136 hours of work in this Canvas course. So I probably had it open and then I got on a Teams call or answered email or something, and it was just sitting there in the background recording time, basically.
Yeah, that's one of the great examples of the limitations of this. So if we want to kind of dive down a little bit deeper, get a little bit more nuanced, what I can do is I can click in on Caleb's name.
I think actually you want to click on my little
I always do that.
Icon. Yeah. Yep.
I'm sorry. We'll get to why we would click on his name later. Clicking on the student picture will take you to some information about them. And over on the right, this is that full access report that we're really focusing on today. So if I was worried about Caleb and I was like, well, he's either spent a lot of time in the course really early on, which might mean he's confused, trying to find things, isn't really navigating efficiently, or on the flip side, hasn't been or has been in for a very, very short amount of time, I could see what Caleb's actually been looking at. So in this case, we can see that, last viewed, this is going to be the last thing that Caleb viewed in this course, looks like about an hour ago. We can see that he was looking at his own profile.
I like looking at myself.
Looked at my profile. Hey, but you can get those kind of individual pages that somebody was on. You'll see information that can be kind of hard to parse out, like, Canvas training banner. Well, just happens that Caleb was on a page where this image was, and because it's an individual object, Canvas goes, they viewed that. Whereas it really would be just Caleb looked at a page, it happened to be on it. But if that image is on multiple pages, that number of times viewed will be inflated. So looking at specific files or images can be, it can inflate numbers and how engaged they are. Right. But looking down a little bit further, looking at our course home, makes sense that would be the thing that is viewed the most. So this is probably where he started his session, right? He accessed the course 2 hours ago, landed on the home page like everybody does.
Image files because they were all on that home page. And then I went off and did something else. And then an hour later, I came back and I was looking at our profile pages in the people section.
Yeah. So you can kind of see that this might be one session. So we get a little bit of an idea of what Caleb's been doing. If we go back to April 7th, we see the individual items that he might have accessed then. The thing is, if it's a resource that somebody's accessing constantly, like in the case of the course homepage, they'll reuse the entry and move it to whatever that last session was. So course home is, you can expect it to be in every single session, right? But since it was accessed last, that's what pushes it up to the top of the list, if that makes sense.
It's a little confusing. Basically, it's showing for every item in this list of content, it's showing the last time I accessed that thing. So it doesn't show duplication. So in some ways, it's very helpful because you can see my most recent activity, but in other ways, it doesn't give you the whole picture of what I've been doing. So like, for example, a little farther down there, there's one for the module 7 quiz. We can see that I accessed that quiz on April 7th, but it doesn't show how all of the dates and times that I accessed that quiz. It only gives us the most recent time. So again, it requires a little bit of interpretation. And that's something that we can help with. If you ever have any questions about these things, if you're looking at student analytic data and you're not quite sure what to make of it, contact Nick or I, and we can sit down with you and help you parse that out.
One thing to clarify, total activity and last activity from that page, the people page, indicates mobile activity, but access reports aren't reporting mobile connections or app connections. So just another thing to know.
Oh, so this does not currently include app activity.
No, it doesn't.
Oh, that's interesting. That's good to know.
Yeah,
so that's another limitation where, because we know that large number of our students mostly use their phones to access their Canvas courses. some of them exclusively on their phones. So that's another thing where this does not give you the whole picture. This
Well,
can be
that's one thing to
useful.
point out, you know, like pre-pandemic, our numbers showed about 11% of all access, 11 to 15% of all access to Canvas was on mobile devices and the apps. We're running those numbers now and it's way higher. It's over 35 up towards 40%. And that's including all faculty access too. When I look at those numbers at weird hours, because I'm a freak like that, I'll look at them at like 4 in the morning or 11 o'clock at night. It's over 45% of current users on Canvas are on a mobile device. So they're accessing it using mobile devices much greater than I ever thought. I kind of had a feeling 11% was low, but now I'm pretty blown away with about 40%.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess that one of the important things there is don't just rely on a single piece of data to try to figure out what is a student's story. We have to look at multiple different pieces of information, and we also still don't want to make any assumptions. So this data is a starting point, not an ending point. So I guess that kind of brings us to the intervention portion of this topic is, let's say you're in here and you find a student that does not have very much time in Canvas, has not accessed the course recently, or maybe hasn't accessed the course at all, and has not turned in an assignment that's already due. One thing that means is it is super helpful to have some kind of activity in the first week or two of class, even if it's low stakes or some kind of formative activity, formative assessment. You should be asking your students to do something in the first week of class, because that is an important data point to make sure that your students are present, engaged, know what they're doing, know how to access things. But if you have a student who you have a concern about, what should you do? So we kind of have, I guess I have kind of like a little flow chart in my head of helpful things that you could do based on the situation. And Nick and Ben and anybody else, really, please jump in if you have a different opinion on some of these things. But Nick, could we go back to the people page for a second?
Yes, sir.
So I would say if you have a student here who does have some activity, but it's not much or it's not recent, the first thing I would probably do is reach out to them using if you use the Canvas inbox as your communication tool, then I would send them a message right away just saying, hey, just checking in on you. How are things going? Are there any questions I can answer? I noticed you haven't turned in that first assignment. Can we help you get caught up? And kind of go from there. That is for the students that have been logging in, but maybe you're just not engaged fully. If you have a student who has either never accessed the course or hasn't accessed it in days or a week, then you have kind of a chicken and the egg problem where you can't really use Canvas to communicate with them if they're not in Canvas. In a situation like that, you might need to get into your course roster in CTC Link and find the student's listed email address and try contacting them that way. But that also sometimes doesn't work because we know, I don't think we have any numbers on this, but anecdotally, we know that many students, when they first register for classes and they're asked to provide an email address, they will provide a parent's email address. Or they might provide a high school email address that is no longer active, or they might create a new email address just to have something to enter, but it's not something that they check on a regular basis. So I would start there, but not every student will check that email address. So that may not always be an effective way of getting a hold of them. If you do that and you still haven't heard back from the student in a day or two, at that point, it would probably be a good idea to submit an early alert report for that student. So if you go to the campus website, either the SCC or the SFCC, you go to employee portal and scroll way down on this list. There are 2 links for early alert, one for SCC and one for SFCC. And if you click on that early alert, it allows you to put in the student's information, tell them why you are concerned about this student. They haven't logged in 2 weeks, or I have not seen them in the class at all yet, and it's week 2. And then a counselor or a specialist from the college will do their best to get a hold of that student, because they have contact information that you may not have access to. I think they can even call the student if it gets to that point. And then hopefully they can provide some support services, refer the student to whatever help they need, whether it's tutoring or mental health or admissions or advising or whatever it is that they need. Hopefully they will get them connected with the help that would be appropriate. And I wouldn't wait on this for too long. I'm thinking, like, if we haven't gotten a hold of that student in the first week or 2, we really need to be putting in these early alerts, because that's how we catch those students before they completely fall through the cracks. And then the other, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna, before we moved on too quickly, I wanted to make sure that everybody here knew that when you do click on, say, a student's name in your People's tab, you have the ability to message them through the Canvas inbox immediately. You can see the last graded items. If they are missing things or have zeros, you can see that all right there after you do the access report. So still building that picture.
Great. And then the other thing I was going to mention is in e-learning, we have a team of student success coaches specifically for online students taking online classes. And our coaches are available to provide things like study skill and study habit coaching, help them understand assignments, help them, decode syllabi if there's any confusion there. And then they also have their own little online Canvas communities of online students where they interact with them, and they have their own little message boards, and they do interactive events and online engagement events for those students so that they can have a sense of community. And it is often a good idea to connect those students with our success coaches if they are taking online classes. Nick, was there anything else we needed to catch in the last couple minutes here? I think we covered everything on our list.
Yeah, I think I'll just reiterate, we've been talking about using data, student data, to try to build a picture of a student that you don't really have an open line of communication with. So you always want to be aware of, just the inherent risk of doing so. You always want to be sure that you're remembering that data is a human being, and there could be so many different things going on that could create that data that you just wouldn't be able to determine without talking to them, connecting with them. So that's why we like to use the data as a tool to help us know who we need to intervene with, communicate, open up those lines, and create those dialogues. So yeah, it's that do no harm mentality, and I'll keep reiterating that. So thank you, Ben, for kind of bringing that vocabulary to our attention.
Great. Well, that's everything we wanted to make sure that we cover today, but we still have some free time if anybody has any other questions. Or Cindy has a great question. How do we access the e-learning student success coaches? Ben, what's the easiest way to get a hold of them?
From the study online page from the website, there's a link to, I believe, Karen. So, yep, the virtual campus.
I think,
yeah, remote student services.
That gets you to Karen, but I also think their information is in a number of places.
That she was right on that page, yeah.
Oh yeah, they're kind of buried.
Totally buried. Let me find a link.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And we'll make sure we put that link in the YouTube recording after we get this posted, hopefully later this afternoon.
ask a question, and another one about the student success coaches?
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of them before. Are they specific to online learning, online students only, or what's the parameters of these particular coaches?
Yeah, they're designed to support online students.
Okay.
Originally for students that were in online programs, so they could provide, the virtual services that campuses offer on ground. And then during the pandemic, that necessitated a larger group. And so we kind of folded some folks into the department from other departments and coached them up. And now we have 3 online student success coaches, and they support about 300 students each. And they do it through a Canvas course. And so depending on the time of the quarter, they're extremely busy answering student questions and helping them, referring them to when to talk to counseling, when to talk to career services, kind of filtering some of their needs, and, little side therapy and some inspiration and, all the stuff that we try to do in our work as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I misinterpreted. I thought it sounds like it's just for any students, not just online people who enrolled in online courses.
It's kind of what we classify as an online student, which is a student who generally takes 2 or more online classes per quarter.
Okay.
And thanks for finding that link, Nick. So in the chat, Nick linked to one of our success coaches, Karen.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm curious if anybody else has if you have any experiences already of trying to do early intervention for your students. What have you done, and what has worked and what hasn't worked? I'd love to hear some. If anybody wants to share, no pressure.
I like to do where you go to the grades and you can message people who didn't complete X, whatever. You can say if they scored 50% or less, you can message them, or if they didn't score at all, you can message them. So I always do that for the people who don't turn something in typically, or say, hey, you have multiple attempts on this. You want to grab your points while you can, it'll still be open. But I use that in the first couple of weeks, and then I'll go to the early alert after that.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, that's another good reason to have some kind of activity in the first week of class, because that grade book tool, we didn't really have time to get into it today. That might be for a future session, but it is a great way to bulk message students as one form of quick early intervention. Thanks, Jen.
I just want to piggyback on that. I do exactly that, but I've never really looked at the data. And so I'm excited to actually incorporate that into the process. And I've not done really early alerts that early in the quarter, but I want to be open to that.
Well, yeah, the only reason, one of the reasons I mentioned it is because I think it's worth paying attention to the certain deadlines on the academic calendar, because there's a deadline for withdrawing with a full refund. There's a deadline for withdrawing without a W on your transcript. And there's one for half refund. So there's these different kind of checkpoints along the first few weeks of the quarter. And we don't want students to withdraw from a class, but if life events happen and for whatever reason they need to drop the class, I would sure feel better if I could contact that student early, figure out what their situation is, and give them the opportunity to do so with the least amount of penalty, so that they are more likely to come back next time when their circumstances change.
Just another point on that, the sooner we know what's going on with the student, the more options we have and the more, intervention and resources we can use with them. I'm on that team, and it's heartbreaking when it's the day after the withdrawal deadline that we get a referral.
Yeah.
And, life has exploded, and really the best thing for them would be just to step away. So that timeline, thank you, Caleb, because that's a huge consideration for the people on the team trying to make those connections. So put the early in early alert.
Well, Megan, I'm glad you're here. I didn't realize you were on that team. I'm just curious, like how much does that get used, and what's the pickup, like what's the rate at which you're able to pull those students back? Or I'm just curious how that's been working out.
Referrals this year are up just across the board. I think we've all felt that in our classes, that student needs are there's just more of them, and maybe a little more intense than we've experienced before. And so we'll reach out by phone and by email. And then if we give them a week, and then if we don't hear back, we reach out again by phone and by email. And sometimes we never hear from students.
Sure.
Or sometimes we hear from them the next quarter. They ignore us, and then in the fall, they like, hey, you wrote to me 6 months ago and offered some help, and now I think I need some help. So I mean, it can be a range of things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, anxiety avoidance is a very real thing. I know I do it sometimes when I know that I shouldn't, but
totally.
The situation is causing a ton of anxiety. Sometimes it's easier to ignore it, but it's really interesting that even though you don't hear from them, you've still planted that seed of support, and they might come back to you later and take you up on that offer. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And they all get a list of resources. So even if they choose to not engage with us, they do have something they can come back to and look at. And I would say one of my favorite things to do, even for my students, not early alert, but just students in my class, if I don't see them participating in that first few days, I call them at home, and it's pure joy because I introduce myself. Hi, I'm your teacher. And they're like, wait, what? You're calling me? And I'm like, yeah, I just noticed you hadn't logged in. Like, can I help you with anything? And so it's a little bit of the surprise factor, but also then they know that I'm paying attention and that I care. And then maybe there was something simple that I could help them navigate to get them engaged in the class, or maybe they were waiting until Saturday because that was their day off, right?
Sure.
A lot of different
That's
things.
really interesting. Another kind of a related activity that Stacy Koutko does, we had her on Tech Talks a couple of quarters ago about her pop-up professor office hours. But what she does in her class is she has a graded activity in, I think, the first week of class, where the activity is every single student needs to schedule a one-on-one Zoom meeting with her. And there's no requirement during that meeting. She just wants them to know how to get a hold of her. She explains to them during those one-on-one meetings, this is what office hours are for. It's for you to talk to me and ask questions and clarify things and get support. And by forcing them to engage one-on-one early, she's seen a huge increase in the amount of students that actually come to her normal office hours, which I thought was pretty cool. I'm always surprised with office hours just because I think I've said this story before, but I once had a student when I was teaching a freshman seminar class tell me, I thought office hours were the time when the instructor was busy in their office and was not to be disturbed. So like, we can't assume that students know what office hours even are. So sometimes we have to really kind of get in their face a little bit about what is available to them and how we can help them be successful. All right, well, we're past time, but I really appreciated the conversation. Hopefully some of those tools will be of interest to you. And again, please contact Nick or I if you have any questions about them or want some help interpreting what the data is telling you, and we would be happy to help with that. All right, thanks everybody for coming. See you next week, hopefully.
Have a good